I was sitting in a crowded neighborhood library last week, and I couldn't help but notice the woman at the table next to me. She looked perfectly ordinary knitted sweater, glasses perched on her nose, sipping tea. But as I glanced over, I realized she wasn't reading a novel. She was leaning into her laptop, eyes fixed on a grainy black and white police interrogation of a notorious cult leader. Her face didn't show a flicker of disgust or fear. Instead, she had this intense, almost scholarly focus, occasionally pausing the frame to jot down notes in a neat floral patterned journal. I struck up a brief conversation, half expecting her to be a researcher or perhaps someone with a dark sense of humor. But she was a retired librarian, soft-spoken and gentle. When I asked what drew her to such a grim subject, she told me something that stopped me cold. She found these stories deeply stabilizing. That word felt completely out of place. How does a detailed account of psychological manipulation and human cruelty provide stability to someone who spent her life surrounded by quiet books and community service? She explained that it wasn't about the darkness itself. She pointed to a specific timestamp on the screen where the suspect's breathing shifted. "I'm not looking for the horror," she said, her voice calm and detached. "I'm looking for the moment the human mind decides to stop being human. If I can see the exact point where the logic breaks, I can convince myself I'll know how to spot it in the real world." To her, that digital window into the occult and the criminal wasn't a descent into evil. It was a map away to build a wall between herself and the chaos of the unknown. It made me realize that most of us are doing the exact same thing when we click on a documentary about unsolved mysteries or scroll through threads on the occult. We aren't looking for the bad taste of violence. We are responding to a biological itch to impose order on the incomprehensible. We treat fear as a puzzle because a puzzle, no matter how grim, has a solution. But why is our sense of safety so paradoxically linked to the things that terrify us most? And what does it say about human nature that we feel the need to study the shadow just to define the shape of the light?
Wow, that is deeply stabilizing. That's such a specific way to put it, but it's brilliant.
Right. It totally caught me off guard. Because, we spend our entire lives trying to be safe.
Okay.
We build these comfortable homes, we get secure jobs, we install alarm systems.
Well, we lock the doors.
Exactly. We do all of that, and then in our leisure time, when we finally have a minute to lower our cortisol levels, what do? We invite the absolute worst of humanity right into our living rooms.
Pour a cup of tea and watch a serial killer.
Yeah. And honestly, it's something I've kind of felt guilty about. You finish a long week, and instead of a comedy, you're like 3 hours deep into a docuseries about a cult.
I think a lot of people listening right now are nodding their heads. They've had that exact same thought.
Well, that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We have this massive stack of research. We're doing a deep dive into covering evolutionary biology, media studies, psychology, and the mission here is clear. We want to move way past this lazy idea that consuming the stuff is just morbid curiosity.
Or just having bad taste.
Right, bad taste. We want to understand it as a really complex mechanism. It's about survival, how we build community, and how we grapple with ethics. It's not just rubbernecking at a car crash.
No, it's trying to understand the mechanics of the engine so you don't crash your own car.
Which makes sense on paper. Sometimes it really does just feel like voyeurism.
Sure.
So, to figure out if there's actually a noble purpose here, where do we even begin?
We actually have to start at the very beginning. Before we had Netflix or podcasts or even written language, we have to go back to the savannah.
Okay, so we're talking about the biological hardware.
Exactly. To understand why you click on that dark thumbnail on a Friday night, we have to look at how human brains are physically wired to process threats.
Well, let me bring in another story I found that I think perfectly frames this biological angle. I saw a thread online about a software engineer in San Francisco named Elias. Every night, after hours of sterile coding in a climate-controlled office, he would return home and immerse himself in documentaries about the most harrowing survival stories and cold cases. To an outsider, it looked like a morbid obsession, but for Elias's brain, it was a biological calibration. His amygdala, understimulated by the safety of his modern life, but overstressed by the invisible uncertainties of his career, found a strange peace in these dark narratives. By watching others navigate extreme peril, his nervous system was running a safe simulation. It allowed him to process the physiological rush of fear and the relief of a resolution, essentially training his brain to derive meaning from chaos without being in actual physical danger. My feelings as I read this. Watching Elias's routine, I realized that our attraction to the dark isn't a moral flaw, it's an evolutionary echo. As someone who covers complex news daily, I see how our minds try to solve fear before it finds us in reality. It's a primal survival mechanism disguised as modern entertainment, a way to map the shadows of the human experience so we don't trip when the lights go out. While the content is heavy, the intent is deeply human. To feel prepared for a world we can never fully control.
Biological calibration, that is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
But here's where my skepticism kicks in. Elias lives in San Francisco. He's not fighting off predators. His biggest threat is maybe a delayed food delivery or a bug in his code. Isn't this ancient software just misfiring?
Well, not necessarily misfiring. The research refers to this as biocultural analysis. Basically, human cognition, the literal way our brains process information, was fine-tuned by natural selection to deal with environmental dangers.
So we're the descendants of the anxious people.
Exactly. If your ancestor heard a rustling in the bushes and ignored it, they got eaten. If they panicked and ran, they survived to pass on their genes.
So Elias isn't broken, he's just using a very old operating system.
Right. We're born with what researchers call a predator template.
A predator template. That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, speaking.
It means that humans are born with abstract templates for danger, already hardwired into our brains. You don't have to teach a toddler to be afraid of a snake-like shape or large forward-facing eyes or sharp teeth. The recoil is instinctual.
Okay, how does that translate to the true crime stuff? The cult leader the librarian was watching didn't have claws or fangs.
And that is where the template gets sophisticated. It updates. When we consume horror or dark narratives, we are activating those ancient threat detection systems, but we're teaching these software new parameters. We're learning that a predator doesn't just mean a bear in the woods. Today, a predator might mean a manipulative narcissist in a suit or a charming stranger at a bar.
So because we don't have to fight off bears anymore, we have to artificially run this program just to keep the threat detection sharp.
There's a model in the data called the Survival Optimization System, or SOS. The primary goal of the human nervous system is to reduce surprise, because in an evolutionary context, surprise usually meant death.
Right, if you're surprised by a tiger, it's too late.
Exactly. So the brain constantly wants to predict the sensory landscape, and it uses our offline time, like when Elias is safe on his couch in San Francisco, to simulate possible encounters with threats.
That is so interesting. So when I'm watching a documentary about a home invasion, I'm not actually just being entertained. My brain is running a simulation. Like, if this happened right now, where would I hide? Which window would I climb out of?
Yes. The formal term for that is vicarious learning. The data explicitly describes this as bridging data to reduce face-to-face encounters with predators. We encode the failures of others so we don't repeat them. If you see a character make a fatal mistake in a story,
like going into the dark basement alone.
Like going into the basement, your brain logs that. It creates a neural note. Do not go into the basement.
It's basically the ultimate life hack. You get to learn how to survive a life or death situation without actually having to risk your life. But wait, let me challenge this a bit. Because I consume a lot of this content, right? But if someone actually broke into my house, I'm pretty sure I would just freeze. Watching 10 hours of criminal profiling hasn't made me an actual detective. Does this simulation actually help us in the real world?
That is a completely fair critique. Right. We aren't learning tactical skills. You aren't learning hand-to-hand combat. What you are learning is emotional regulation.
Emotional regulation.
Yes. You are practicing the feeling of fear. This ties directly into the neurochemistry.
Yeah.
When you watch these narratives, your amygdala, the primitive threat center of your brain, reacts as if the threat is real. It dumps adrenaline, endorphins, dopamine into your system.
So my body genuinely thinks I'm in danger.
Your amygdala does, yes. It hits the panic button. But, and this is the crucial part, your frontal cortex, the logical modern part of your brain, knows it's a documentary. It looks around, sees the soft lighting, the bowl of popcorn, and it sends a signal back saying, hold on, we're safe.
So it's a tug of war between the old brain and the new brain.
The researchers actually call it a safe bargain. You get the physiological rush, that high arousal of surviving a threat, but with zero actual risk of dying.
That completely reminds me of this fascinating case study I saw in the notes. The woman with the amygdala damage.
Oh, the SM case?
Yeah, Cation SM. She had this rare genetic condition that basically destroyed her amygdala. She literally lost the biological capacity to feel fear. The researchers took her to one of those extreme haunted house attractions, you know, where actors jump out of the dark with fake chainsaws.
Places where a normal person's heart rate would be through the roof.
Exactly. Most people would be screaming, running away. But SM, she just casually walked up to the monsters and started poking them. She was curious about the rubber material on their masks. No physiological recoil at all.
Which sounds kind of like a superpower until you realize how dangerous it is.
Right, because without that fear response, she had actually put herself in extremely dangerous situations in her real life. She didn't have that internal alarm bell telling her to get out of a bad neighborhood or run away from a dangerous person.
And that proves that fear is fundamentally a protective, informative mechanism. We need it. And because we need it, we actively seek out ways to keep it calibrated.
So this whole idea of morbid curiosity, we shouldn't even look at it as a defect. The research frames it as a drive to collect data.
There's a media theory called uses and gratifications. It argues that we select media to fulfill very specific psychological needs. In this genre, the primary need is understanding and mastery.
We don't just want to see the crime happen, we desperately want to know why it happened.
Because if we understand the why, we can convince ourselves we have the mastery to prevent it from happening to us.
It's like filing away a mental safety manual.
Exactly. Think about how kittens play. They pounce on each other, they bite, they hide. They aren't trying to murder their siblings. They are playing at predator evasion. They are practicing.
So Elias, in San Francisco, watching a documentary about a blizzard survival story, is essentially just a kitten pouncing on a ball of yarn.
Yes. He is keeping his survival instincts sharp in a modern world that is constantly trying to dull them with comfort.
Okay, that actually makes me feel a lot better about my own viewing habits. It's not that we enjoy the suffering of others, we are enjoying the practice of survival.
Right.
But here is where it gets even more complex. Because we aren't just practicing in isolation anymore. Thousands of years ago, we would share these threat narratives around a fire to keep the whole village safe.
And today, that fire is a glowing screen.
Exactly. Which brings us to the sociological layer of this deep dive. Because fear is heavy. And humans, being social creatures, we don't like carrying heavy things alone.
We really don't.
Listen to this next story from the research because it completely shifted my perspective. I read a story about a digital community of women who spend their nights in a dedicated Discord server dissecting unsolved mysteries. One member, a school teacher named Clara, described these forums as her digital campfire. In a world that feels increasingly fragmented and unpredictable, discussing the darkest aspects of human nature with strangers gave her a profound sense of control and belonging. They weren't there for the gore, they were there to build a collective manual for survival. By sharing the what-ifs of the world's most terrifying events, they transformed their individual anxieties into a shared fortress of knowledge. For Clara, the horror wasn't the point. The community built around the shared processing of that horror was the cure for her urban isolation. My feelings as I read this. It's fascinating how we use the macabre to build modern tribes. While some might find it unsettling to see people bonding over tragedy from a sociological perspective, this is a sophisticated form of emotional regulation. We are social creatures who have always gathered to tell stories of the beasts in the woods to keep the village safe. In the digital age, the beasts have changed shape, but the need to huddle together and make sense of the darkness remains a vital part of our social fabric.
It perfectly captures that primal feeling of sitting in the dark, finding one source of light, and relying on the safety of the group.
Yes.
The academic term for this phenomenon is affective publics.
Affective publics.
Sure. Normally, when sociologists talk about publics or groups online, they talk about deliberative publics. Those are groups formed around facts or political debates or policy goals. But an affective public is formed entirely around shared emotional responses.
So the glue holding Claire's Discord server together isn't a political agenda. It's the shared feeling of anxiety, curiosity, and this drive for justice.
Exactly. The internet took what used to be a solitary activity like reading a true crime paperback alone in your bed and turned it into a massive collective investigation.
Which brings to mind the ultimate example of this, the podcast Serial.
Absolutely. 2014, that changed everything.
I remember listening to that, and it didn't feel like I was just being fed a news report. It felt like I was riding shotgun with the host, like we were looking at the cell tower maps together.
You and millions of other people.
Right. I remember going to dinner parties, and that was literally the only thing anyone wanted to talk about. Did he do it? What about the timeline?
And that is the brilliance of that format. It invited the audience to interrogate the details alongside the host. It created a shared emotional experience that helps regulate the fear. There is a psychological principle here. Fear, when shared, becomes manageable.
Because if I'm scared alone, I'm just vulnerable.
But if we're all scared together, we are alert. We're a watch party.
That makes total sense. But there is a very specific demographic reality here that we have to talk about. The data is incredibly clear that women are the primary consumers of true crime and dark content.
So,
And on the surface, that seems so counterintuitive to me. If you are statistically more vulnerable to certain types of real-world violence, stalking, domestic abuse, why would you want to immerse yourself in stories about it? Why watch your own worst nightmare on a loop?
It does seem like a paradox. But it links right back to Claire's idea of a survival manual. The research suggests this consumption is driven precisely by that heightened fear of victimization.
So it's not about wallowing in fear.
No, it's tactical. By watching these breakdowns, women are building a mental database of red flags. They're asking, what did the attacker say to gain her trust? How did he bypass the lock?
It's reconnaissance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a way of looking at a terrifying world and saying, I refuse to be blindsided.
Yeah.
It provides a sense of taking control back.
That immediately makes me think of the massive hit podcast, My Favorite Murder. Their whole catchphrase is stay sexy and don't get murdered.
SSADGM.
Yes. And to an outsider who doesn't understand the culture, that phrase probably sounds incredibly glib or even disrespectful to the victims.
But inside that affective public, inside that community, it functions like a talisman. It uses humor to cope with a reality that is otherwise too grim to handle daily.
It's a shared acknowledgement. Like, we all know the world is dangerous for us, so let's laugh together, bond together, and keep each other safe.
Right. It culturally shifts the listener from being a potential victim into being a savvy navigator of the threat landscape.
Powerful. But, and I have to play devil's advocate here, this whole web sleuthing, digital campfire thing, it isn't always supportive and healthy, is it? It can get really ugly.
Oh, it can become incredibly toxic. There is a very sharp double-edged sword to digital detective work.
Because we've all seen it happen. A tragedy occurs, and suddenly a Reddit thread decides they know exactly who did it, and they end up accusing an innocent person, doxing them, ruining their life.
Vigilantism is the dark side of this community building. On the positive side, you have instances like the documentary Don't Freck with Cats, where amateur internet sleuths actually tracked down Luca Magnotta. They were analyzing the type of vacuum cleaner in the background of his videos, matching the brand of cigarettes. It was unbelievable forensic work done by people sitting at home.
And it gave them a massive sense of agency. We caught the bad guy when the police couldn't.
But the source material points out the terrifying flip side of that specific case. Magnotta was watching them back.
He knew they were looking for him.
He was taunting them. He created fake accounts to stir the pot and feed them misinformation. It became this twisted game of cat and mouse, and he loved the attention.
So by participating in the hunt, the community was actually feeding the exact narcissism that was driving his crimes.
They became his audience. And you have to wonder, without that audience, would his crimes have escalated the way they did? And that leads to the bigger problem of internet justice. When fans forget the boundary between being a consumer of content and being a qualified criminal investigator, real investigations get compromised. Police tip lines get flooded with wild theories based on something someone heard on a podcast.
It turns real-life justice into a massive multiplayer game.
And it completely distorts our relationship with the hosts of these shows, too. We talked about Serial feeling like you were in a car with a friend. That creates what media psychologists call a parasocial relationship.
Meaning a one-sided friendship.
Exactly. We listen to these hosts for hundreds of hours. We know their inside jokes, we know the names of their pets, and this intimacy fulfills our social need for belonging, but it often leads to commodifying the host's personality over the actual tragedy of the victim.
True, and it makes me feel a bit uneasy because we start tuning in to hear our friend make a witty observation, and we completely forget that the subject of the observation is a real person who lost their life.
We review tragedy as if it were fiction. People will leave a one-star review on a podcast saying, the murder wasn't suspenseful enough this week, or the host wasn't funny.
Reviewing a real murder like it's a bad movie script.
Right. Which brings us right to the edge of the ethical precipice. Because at the end of the day, no matter how much biological calibration or community building is happening, these are real people, real bodies.
And this is exactly what I struggle with the most. This tension between understanding the dark and exploiting it. Which leads perfectly into our final story for this deep dive. This isn't about our ancient biology or our Discord servers anymore. This is about morality. Imagine a young graduate student named Julian whose research involves staring into the abyss of forensic psychology every single day. He often speaks about the thin glass wall he must maintain between his professional curiosity and his personal peace. One evening, after a long session of analyzing violent behavioral patterns, he caught himself scrolling through a sensationalist true crime tabloid that glamorized the perpetrator. He felt a physical chill, not of fear, but of a moral boundary being crossed. He realized that the moment his curiosity shifted from, how can we prevent this, to let me see more of the pain, he was losing his grip on the ethical purpose of his work. He had to learn to look at the darkness without letting it become a commodity for his own entertainment. My feelings as I read this. Julian's struggle highlights the delicate ethical balance we all face when consuming dark content. As a professional who filters reality for an audience, I have to constantly ask, am I informing or am I voyeuristically exploiting? Julian's story is a necessary reminder that while exploring the human shadow side is essential for a deeper understanding of our world, we must ensure our gaze remains analytical and empathetic. We must respect the weight of the tragedy to truly honor the humanity we are trying to protect.
That phrase, the thin glass wall, is so evocative because it is incredibly fragile. It is the exact line where curiosity ends and commodification begins.
And there is a massive multi-million-dollar industry built entirely on shattering that glass wall.
Absolutely. The research digs into this concept of murderabilia.
Ugh, even just the word makes my skin crawl.
It's disturbing. It's the literal commercialization of justice. We're talking about a market where people buy and sell items owned by killers.
Like John Wayne Gacy's paintings.
Or locks of hair or jars of dirt from a crime scene.
Who is buying that? And why? I mean, what is the psychological drive to own dirt from a crime scene?
Well, for some, it's just the pure taboo of it, the edginess. But for others, they feel this bizarre, almost magical connection to the power of the perpetrator. It is the ultimate example of interest mutating into exploitation. But murderabilia isn't just physical objects anymore.
Right, it's the media itself.
Exactly. When a streaming platform rushes a glossy, highly stylized drama into production about a serial killer who was just caught 6 months ago, is that documentation or is that digital murderabilia?
It feels entirely like exploitation. It's packaging trauma for profit, and it makes me wonder what this constant diet of stylized violence is doing to our worldview. If Elias is watching survival horror every single night, does he eventually just stop trusting the guy who delivers his mail?
He might. The psychological term for that is mean world syndrome.
Mean world syndrome.
It was coined by a researcher named George Gerbner. The theory demonstrates that excessive consumption of violent media leads to a highly distorted worldview. You start to believe that extreme violent crime is far more prevalent than the statistics actually show.
So your threat detection software gets a virus, basically. It starts seeing threats everywhere.
You stop trusting your neighbors.
Yeah.
You assume the absolute worst intentions in everyday interactions.
You essentially become a prisoner of your own preparation.
You build a defensive wall so high that you lock yourself inside. And alongside that paranoia comes a profound desensitization. The research was very blunt about this. One source noted that we are so inundated with narratives about dead girls in American media culture that we have become completely numb to the grotesque exploitation of it.
We don't even see a human being anymore. We see a plot device.
A body on a slab becomes nothing more than the inciting incident for the detective's character arc. We don't think that was someone's daughter. We think, ooh, a mystery to solve.
Which brings up the victims themselves. Because we have to talk about who actually gets to be a story in this culture. It's not a random selection, is it?
Collective. This is a major critique covered in the data, often referred to as missing white woman syndrome.
Right, where the media decides which victims are newsworthy based on a very specific set of criteria.
Are they wealthy? Are they conventionally attractive? Did the crime happen in a nice suburban neighborhood? And overwhelmingly, are they white?
It's devastating because it implies that some victims are simply better content than others. If a marginalized person goes missing or someone from a low-income area, the news vans don't show up. There are no multi-part podcast investigations. But if a young, affluent woman goes missing, it becomes a national obsession.
It creates a stark hierarchy of victimhood. It signals to society whose lives actually matter to the public narrative. And even for the families of the victims who do get the media spotlight, it's often a waking nightmare.
Because their personal tragedy is suddenly public property.
The sources specifically mentioned the family of Hae Min Lee, the victim at the center of the Serial podcast, or the Chapin family. We have to remember that while we are casually listening to these stories on our commute, the families are having the absolute worst day of their entire lives replayed on a global loop. Forever.
And they never opted into it. They didn't sign a release form for their grief to become entertainment.
There is a massive conflict here regarding privacy rights. We, as the audience, often feel entitled to the details. We think we have a right to know the truth. But the research highlights arguments from people like the memoirist Susanna Kaysen, who points out that the public does not have an inherent right to know everything about a person, just because they suffered.
When the true crime community demands crime scene photos or demands to know every graphic detail, we are essentially re-victimizing the family under the guise of seeking justice.
It becomes a parasitic relationship. We feed on their trauma.
And this is where it gets really uncomfortable, just despite knowing all of this ethical murkiness, despite the guilt we feel and the exploitation we see, we are still irresistibly drawn to the killer. We want to know the perpetrator. Why? Why do we care so much about the monsters?
This is where the psychology gets philosophical. We are entering the territory of the dark passenger.
Oh, like the TV show Dexter.
Exactly like Dexter. The main character is a serial killer who hunts other killers, and he constantly refers to his urge to kill as his dark passenger.
Dexter is such a fascinating cultural artifact because it takes that dark urge and completely externalizes it. It makes the shadow visible.
And metaphorically, the dark passenger isn't just about literal murder. It represents the shadow side of human nature that exists in all of us. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the shadow, the repressed, dark aspects of the unconscious mind.
So when we obsess over a serial killer documentary, are we looking at them to reassure ourselves? Like, look at him, he's a monster, I am nothing like him.
But the deeper, more terrifying truth is that we are looking to see where we don't differ. We are fascinated by the monster within. We want to examine what psychologists call the mask of sanity.
The mask of sanity.
The profound terror and the absolute fascination comes from the realization that the worst monsters often look exactly like us. Think back to the cult leader from your library story.
Right. He wasn't a cartoon villain with horns. He was just a guy.
He was a man in a sweater drinking tea.
And that is the scariest thought of all. If he looks just like me, could I be him? Could the guy sitting next to me on the bus be him?
It forces us to ask terrifying philosophical questions. The sources actually bring in thinkers like Nietzsche and Dostoevsky here, because these dark narratives force us to question the actual validity of human morality. If a human being with the same brain structure as me is capable of committing these unspeakable acts, what does it actually mean to be human?
Are we all really just one terrible day or one chemical imbalance away from becoming the villain?
We are staring directly into the abyss, trying to map its edges.
And hoping the abyss doesn't stare back.
Or maybe we already know the abyss is inside us, and we are just trying to understand our own capacity for darkness so that we can actively choose the light.
That feels like the ultimate connection point for everything we've talked about today. It's this incredible continuous thread.
It really is a complete ecosystem.
We start with Elias in San Francisco, the neurons firing in his brain, driven by an ancient biological need to predict threats and survive.
Then we move to Clara on her Discord server, mitigating that raw biological fear by sharing the burden with a digital tribe.
And finally, we end up with Julian staring through that thin glass wall, the psychological struggle to maintain our empathy and our humanity while looking at the absolute inhumane.
It totally recontextualizes the genre.
It really changes how I'm going to look at my continue watching queue tonight. This isn't just trash TV. It's not just Pulp Fiction or noise.
No, it is a profoundly modern manifestation of ancient survival instincts. It is how we handle the undeniable fact that we are mortal, vulnerable creatures living in a very unpredictable world. We are desperately trying to make the unknown known.
We're just trying to stay safe.
And trying to understand.
This has been such an incredible journey through the dark. I think the real takeaway from all of this research is that the dark passenger isn't just in the criminals we watch on screen. It is the part of us that wants to watch them. And by acknowledging that part, by looking at it honestly, we don't become the darkness. We integrate it. We study the cracks in the human psyche, not to break ourselves, but to understand how to stay whole in a broken world.